Hello everyone, and welcome to my session tonight. My name is David and I'm a cloud architect, and I have been a consultant for all my career, and that's like 15 years or so. And I have been working with Azure since the dawn of time, when Azure was released for 10 years ago. But as an architect, I find it very good to still code, so I still love the coding parts. And when I'm very passionate about software craftsmanship and the quality that comes with the software craftsmanship. And I'm also very fond of the solid principles. And as a developer, you need to have a favorite principle. And here my favorite principle is O, that is the open-closed principle. And how does an ordinary day look for me as a cloud architect? Actually, I have several customers at the same time, and some of the customers I advise in Azure-related questions, and some other customers I'm very hands-on and writing POCs and stuff like that. And at other customers, I dig more into the code. Those customers have come a bit further than the other customers, so there I can work with infrastructure as code, and I usually use ARM templates or Terraform to set up the infrastructure via code. At some customers, I'm also some kind of quality assurance person, and then I often consult system development teams in how they should set up their architecture or how they have set up the architecture. So let's move on to the more interesting parts of the evening. First, I'm going to talk about how Azure has evolved during time. Back in the days, before there was Azure, we just moved to virtual machines. Actually, that was a real big step forward, to be able to have a virtual machine instead of on-prem servers, that is physical servers. So the virtual machines was a very good thing, according to my opinion. But when Azure came, then they moved those virtual machines to Azure. And this wasn't really cloud. They just hosted the virtual machines in the cloud. But that wasn't real cloud. So when the Azure services came, this was a giant leap towards setting up more serverless architecture. So very many of us moved the virtual machines and took the applications and hosted them in app services instead. And this is cloud-ish, according to my opinion. You need to go even further and beyond the app service only. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So how do you move beyond the app service only? I think it's a very good approach to start with a simple service, like an app service, and then you need to iterate the architecture all the time. You need to iterate the whole solution. Another thing that is very important is to know which services is related and know how to combine those related services. Because a lot of the services are quite similar, but they handle the problem in slightly different ways. So it's very important to use the right service for the right type of problem. And here we have a link where we can see all the services, and you get a description of how the services works. Here is a website which lists all the services, and you get some information about the services. It is also very important to know, as I said before, how to combine the services and get some architecture from them. So actually we have another link where Microsoft has provided some kind of reference architecture for how you can combine all the services in a very good way. And I will provide the links to those sites in the presentation. It is also very important that you do not overuse the services. I have seen development teams that just use the services because when Microsoft releases some kind of new cool service, a lot of the developers just want to use this service just to try it out. But please do not do this. Use the correct service for the right type of problem. If you want to use a new service, then you can have some kind of proof of concept, or even better, if you have some kind of private project you're working on where you can try the service out. Another thing you should not do is try to do a big bang. And with big bang, I mean to try to set up the architecture all at once. So please, instead of a big bang, you should iterate the solution all the time and drive the architecture forward by iterating it. And how do we plan to move the legacy applications to Azure? Often I use a 3-step model for this, and the model looks like this. First, I define a current as-is state. This is the current state for the system or the application or the applications, if you have several applications. And then I define some kind of visionary or strategic to-be state. And this state is where you want to have your application or your system in like 1 year or 2 years. This is actually, there isn't a silver bullet. You can have the same to-be state for all your customers, all your applications. You need to define a single to-be state for each applications that you want to move. After this, we have the transition phase, and this is where all the magic happens. This is the part and the phase where you actually start to move your applications to Azure. And now I will talk a bit more how we use these different states. As I said, in the as-is state, we define the current state of the application or the entire system. When I'm working with defining the as-is state, I also find external integrations. And external integration, it don't need to be external API calls or something like that. It can be calls to external databases or even internal database call. And then I try to find seams in the system. And with seam, I mean some part of the system where you can tear the system apart to get more handleable, loosely coupled parts of the system. And this term seams, it came from the test-driven development. And in test-driven development, the seams are parts where you inject interfaces to create more decoupled solutions. So I take this concept and introduce it when I'm working with Azure architecture as well. I also identify applications that we can move, but also those applications that we cannot move. And it's also very important to identify applications that are not worth moving. And this can, for instance, be an application that soon will reach some kind of end of life, some contract that will not be renewed or something like that. In the to-be state, I defined the strategic and visionary, what I call a target condition. And then examples of target conditions can, for instance, be a solution that can scale infinite when new users are added, or it can be an autonomous service that can be reused by any other application, or it can be some kind of plug-and-play platform where customers can add their own applications. So it's important to know that the target condition is different for each application. And it's also very important to know that the target condition probably never will be reached. This should be some kind of guidance where you should steer your architecture. And the reason for why it never will be reached is because the requirement will change all the time. So maybe it will be reached, but not the target condition that you define here and now. And then it's time for the actually transition. And as I said before, it's in the transition where you code all the parts, you create the new services. So it's here that the magic happens. And you need to have some kind of plan. You can't just run to your computer and open Visual Studio and start to code. But please do not overwork the plan. And with overwork the plan, I mean do not just sit down and draw fancy architectural diagrams and stuff like that. Diagrams are very good to have when you're working with architecture, but they very often get outdated very fast. And those diagrams actually can be generated by Visual Studio, or you can generate those diagrams from within Azure. So, according to my opinion, this is a better approach, to let the code generate the architect diagrams for you. And also very important is to not have an ivory tower approach. And with this I mean you shouldn't be an architect that sits in your tower and look out over the landscape, and then sometimes you climb down from your tower and go out in the landscape and talk to some people, and then climb up again in your tower and draw your fancy diagrams. The thing you should do is to attend in the daily work. You should be a part in the team. And with the team, I do not just mean the developers. The team is greater than just the developers. It consists of the product owners, the UX people, the testers. Even you can see like a CEO can even be part of the team in an economic way. Further on, you have the transition, and I said it before and I say it again, that I don't think that big bangs will work. That is, you take the whole application and try to implement it all at once. Instead, you should assess the architecture all the time and try to continuously improve the architecture. I usually compare the architecture with a garden. If you don't mow your lawn or cut your trees and bushes, it will grow wild. And the same thing applies to architecture. It will grow wild if you don't assess it all the time and work with continuous improvement. And of course, this applies to all architecture. This is not just cloud architectures. And another thing that is important to know is that when working with legacy application, you will come to a hybrid solution. And a hybrid solution is an architecture when you have some part of the application in the cloud and some parts of the architecture on-prem. And often it is the database that needs to be on-prem, maybe for Swedish companies, and some of the companies need to have their data stored on-prem because Azure today do not have any data centers in Sweden. And I guarantee you that this will happen when working with legacy application. So you need to have a solution for those kind of hybrid solutions. One tip from a coach, I would call it, is to, if you haven't worked with event-driven architectures before, I think it's a really good solution to take a look at these event-driven architectures. Later tonight, we will hear Jenny talk about event-driven architectures and how they even can increase performance in your Azure architecture. And of course, everything new you're building or that your company is building, you should build it in Azure. I also need to say something about security management. Actually, this is a completely different talk, but I need to mention something about security. Just putting an application in Azure does not make it secure. All security rules still applies. So as a developer, you need to think about security. And in Azure, every application handles its own security. It's not like in the old days when you have an on-prem solution with a network around all the applications. That was before. Now when we are working in Azure, you need to have the mindset that the application handles its own security. It is also very important that you apply all the recommendations from Azure Security Center. The recommendations are not silver bullets, but it will make your application more secure. Another thing you need to know about is the cost that comes with Azure services. The same service, but in different tiers, can have a very different pricing. This, as a developer, can be very good to know. So you shouldn't just spin up a lot of new services, because this can become very expensive. This is also a completely different talk, but I just want to mention this in this talk. So, to round up this evening, I will provide some good links. We have looked at 2 of them before, and I also have added a 3rd link. First, we have a link that lists all the services in Azure, and you can get descriptions of what they do and how much they cost. Then there is a link about architecture and how to combine Azure services. And the last link is a link for Azure updates. Here, Microsoft lists all the updates that comes to Azure. There are new service added and improvement of existing services. So this ends up my talk tonight, and now we shall proceed with Jenny's talk about how they have implemented an Azure architecture in an event-driven way. Thank you very much, and see you soon.